The autumn sun was a pale, washed-out yellow, trying its best to warm the stones of the city square. It was one of those in-between days, not quite cold enough for winter coats, but with a bite in the air that promised it was coming. The square was the city's living room, a patch of open space where all the different threads of life got tangled together. Tourists with maps held open, like sails, wandered in slow circles, looking up at the old statues. Office workers, released for their lunch hour, marched with purpose toward coffee shops, their faces already tired, even though the day was only half done. Kids chased pigeons who were too fat and used to people to be scared, just waddling away at the last second dot and right in the middle of it all. Next to the trickling water of the central fountain stood the piano. It was a public piano, its dark wood polished to a shine by the city's maintenance crew. Someone had painted swirling, colorful flowers along its sides, and in cheerful letters on the front, it said, "Play me." Most people walked right past it. Sometimes a brave teenager would plonk out the first few notes of Chopsticks before getting embarrassed and running off with their friends. Sometimes an older man would sit and carefully play a wobbly version of an old song from his youth, his fingers stiff, but his face soft with memory. It was part of the square's background noise, like the fountain and the distant sirens dot against the south wall of the square. Sitting on a folded piece of cardboard was a man. He wasn't old, but life had etched deep lines around his eyes and across his forehead. His coat was a faded green, an old military-style thing that had seen better decades. It was bulky, but it didn't look warm. He had a backpack beside him, its fabric worn thin and patched with duct tape. He didn't beg. He didn't call out. He just sat, watching the world move past him like a river around a stone. People's eyes slid over him and away. A skill city folks learn so they don't have to feel anything. He had a name, but nobody in the square knew it. To them, he was just part of the scenery. His thoughts today were simple, basic, almost animal. They weren't about the past or the future. They were about the deep, hollow ache in his stomach. It was a grinding, constant feeling that pushed everything else out. He watched as a well-dressed woman walked by, taking a big bite of a shiny red apple. The crunch sounded like thunder. He saw a group of friends laughing, sharing a box of hot, greasy fries from the vendor on the corner. The smell of salt and oil wrapped around him, but the strongest smell came from the little gourmet sandwich cart parked right across from the piano. It was a fancy cart, painted glossy black. The vendor was a stout man with a neat apron, serving up thick sandwiches on crusty bread with ingredients like roasted peppers and aged cheddar and pesto. The smell was incredible warm bread, melting cheese, sharp mustard. It was a smell from a different world, a world of kitchens and tables and warmth. The man against the wall watched the vendor make a sandwich. He saw the careful layers, the drizzle of sauce, the final wrap in crisp paper. His mouth watered so much it hurt. He knew asking outright was a risk. Sometimes people were kind. Sometimes they were cruel. Mostly they were just busy. But the hunger was a dictator. It gave the orders. He took a slow, deep breath, pulling the cold air into his lungs. He pushed himself up from the cardboard, his joints stiff from the cold stone. He adjusted his worn coat, a pointless gesture, and started walking across the square. His walk was slow, not steady. He felt every eye, real or imagined, on him. He was a stain on the pretty picture, a dark smudge moving through the bright crowd. He kept his focus on the sandwich cart. The vendor had just finished a transaction, handing a wrapped sandwich to a customer with a smile, and was now wiping his hands on a cloth. The man reached the cart. The vendor looked up, and the friendly customer service smile on his face froze, then faded. His eyes did a quick automatic scan, the frayed coat cuffs, the dirt under the fingernails, the tired, weathered face. It was a look the man by the wall knew well. It wasn't even mean, not yet. It was just a closing door. The words came out soft, scratchy from lack of use. "Excuse me?" The vendor gave a small, tight nod, saying nothing, his body language already saying, "Go away." The man swallowed. "Can I?" He paused, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I play for food?" He gestured a thumb toward the public piano, just a few steps away. For a second, the vendor just stared. Then his lips pressed together. His eyebrows went up. He didn't yell. He didn't get angry. He let out a single sharp puff of air from his nose. A scoff. It was a sound of pure, unimpressed dismissal. He looked the man up and down once more, as if checking he'd heard right. "Play?" The vendor said, his voice flat. "Rather you didn't, mate. It's bad for business." He turned his shoulder. A clear, physical end to the conversation, and started rearranging bottles of sauce on his cart. His back a wall. A couple of teenagers nearby, waiting for their order, snickered. One of them mimed playing a tiny, silly piano with 2 fingers, smirking. Their laughter was short, but it hung in the air. The man by the cart felt his face grow hot. The shame was a quick, hot wave, but it was immediately drowned by the colder, deeper ocean of his hunger. The rejection was a stone in his gut, but the empty ache was bigger. He stood there for a moment, useless. The sounds of the square, the laughter, the chatter, the fountain muffled and distant, as if he were underwater. He looked from the vendor's rigid back to the piano. The cheerful "play me" seemed to mock him now. What was the worst that could happen? Another scoff? More laughter? He was already at the bottom. There was no farther to fall. He turned, not back toward his wall, but toward the piano bench. His movements were slow, heavy, like he was walking through wet cement. The teenagers watched him, their smirks fading into curiosity. A few other people in the square noticed the odd sight. This shabby man, just rejected, heading for the piano. They expected a performance, all right. A performance of pity. Maybe he'd bang on the keys for a second, then hold out his hand. They braced themselves for an awkward scene they could gossip about later. The man reached the piano. He didn't sit down right away. He just stood beside it, looking at the black and white keys. They were clean, almost glowing in the weak sunlight. He reached out one hand, his fingers trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from the cold and the weakness. He didn't touch the keys. He just let his rough, calloused fingertips hover an inch above them, as if feeling their warmth. Then, he slowly, carefully, lowered himself onto the wooden bench. He sat up straight, not slouching like he did against the wall. He placed his worn backpack on the ground beside him. He took another deep, shuddering breath, closing his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, he wasn't looking at the crowd, or the vendor, or even the sandwich cart. He was looking at the keys like they were an old map, a familiar landscape he knew every hill and valley of. He lifted his hands. They were workers' hands, scarred and strong, but also elegant, with long fingers. They were dirty, yes, but they poised above the keyboard with a natural, easy grace that didn't match the rest of him. It was the first hint, the first little crack in the world's expectation. The small, scattered audience held their breath, waiting for the clumsy, sad notes. What they got was a chord. Not a single plinking note. A chord. He brought his hands down, and a deep, rich, complex sound bloomed in the square. It was a low, minor key chord, full of shadows and depth. It wasn't loud, but it was solid. It vibrated in the air, cutting straight through the chatter and the fountain's noise. It was a sound that demanded attention. The vendor, still turned away, paused his wiping. His head tilted just a fraction. One of the teenagers stopped texting. The chord hung in the air, and then the man's hands began to move. The chord wasn't just a sound. It was a door, slamming shut on the noisy square. It cut through everything. The laughing kids, the phone conversations, the hiss of the coffee machine from the cart. For a second, it was just that one, rich, complicated sound hanging in the cool air. Then his hands started to move. It wasn't the hesitant plinking people expected. His fingers, those dirty, long-fingered hands, knew exactly what they were doing. The deep chord melted into a melody. It was slow at first and sad. A lonely, wandering tune that sounded like walking through empty streets late at night, under streetlights. It was a blues tune, but not one you'd ever heard before. It felt old and personal, like a story told without words. The man at the sandwich cart turned all the way around, the cloth forgotten in his hand. His face, which just moments ago was pinched with annoyance, went slack. The scoff was gone, replaced by a look of pure confusion. This didn't make sense. The person on the bench was changing, right in front of him. The slumped shoulders were straight now, rolling gently with the rhythm. The man's head dipped toward the keys, not in shame, but in focus, like he was listening to a voice only he could hear. The two teenagers who had snickered didn't move. One had his phone halfway out of his pocket, probably to record a joke, but now he just held it, frozen. The music didn't sound silly. It sounded real. The melody started to grow. It picked up a little speed, a little strength. The man's left hand began walking a bass line, a steady, pulsing heartbeat underneath the right hand's sad song. It was complex. You could hear, wasn't just something he'd memorized from the radio. This was being made up, or remembered from somewhere deep inside. His fingers crossed over each other, dancing, sure and confident. A woman walking past with shopping bags stopped so suddenly the person behind her almost bumped into her. She didn't even notice. She just stared at the man on the bench. Her annoyed expression softened, then fell away completely. She'd taken piano lessons as a girl for years. She knew how hard this was. She saw the technique in his curved fingers, the control in his wrists. This wasn't a homeless man playing. This was a pianist. Word spreads in a square not by shouting, but by stillness. One person stops, then two, then a small group. They weren't crowding him, but they formed a loose half-circle, a respectful distance away. A delivery man on a bike slowed, put a foot down on the pavement, and listened. An older couple on a bench, who had been arguing quietly about which bus to take, fell silent. The man reached over and took the woman's hand, and she let him. The music changed again. The lonely blues melody began to twist into something bigger, something grander and more troubled. It echoed with the deep, rumbling feeling of old classical music, the kind that shakes your chest. It was powerful, full of stormy emotions. The man's body moved with it now. He wasn't just playing the piano. He was in it. He leaned into the loud, crashing parts, his whole frame driving energy into the keys. Then he'd pull back, his shoulders falling. His touch becoming so gentle, the notes were like whispers, like tears. He played a run of notes so fast his fingers were a blur. A waterfall of sound that climbed up the keyboard and then tumbled back down. Perfectly clear, every note the tiny pearl. The young woman who had taken lessons felt her own throat tighten. She could never, ever do that. It wasn't just practice. It was a gift. The sandwich vendor took a small step forward, then another. He wasn't the center of attention anymore. His cart, his sandwiches, his world were all unimportant now. All that existed was the sound coming from that painted piano. The shame he'd felt earlier, that quick, hot feeling of being rude, started to curdle in his stomach into something else, something heavier. He had judged the book by its cover, and the cover had been a lie. He saw the musician's face now, in profile. His eyes were closed. He wasn't in the square. He was somewhere else, traveling on the music. A little girl, maybe 4 or 5, tugged on her father's jacket. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice loud in the quiet. "Why is the music sad?" "I don't know, sweetheart," her father whispered back, his eyes glued to the man's flying hands. "It just is." The man at the piano heard none of this. He was gone. The cold bench, the hungry ache in his stomach, the eyes on him, it had all dissolved. The music was a time machine. It took him back to a warm room with a rug on the floor. It took him back to a piano that was his friend, the one thing that always listened. He could smell the old wood polish, feel the give of the well-worn pedals under his feet. He saw smiling faces, now gone. He felt pride, now lost. The melody he was playing was a map of his life, the joy, the love, the crushing loss, the long, quiet years of silence. Every mischance, every goodbye, poured out through his fingertips. It wasn't a sad song anymore. It was everything. It was anger at how things had turned out. It was love for what he'd once had. It was the simple, heartbreaking beauty of remembering. A tear escaped from his closed eye, tracing a clean path through the dirt on his cheek. He didn't brush it away. He didn't even know it was their dot in the crowd. More than a few people found their own eyes getting wet. They didn't know his story. They didn't need to. The music told them all they needed to know. This was a man who had loved and lost and carried a world inside him they'd never guessed was there. The office worker who was stressed about a meeting forgot the meeting. The tourist put away his camera. No picture could capture this. They were all connected, strangers from different lives, pulled into the same feeling by a few minutes of music. The piece built and built. It wasn't just noise. It was a story rushing toward its end. The left hand pounded out deep, dramatic chords like a heartbeat gone wild. The right hand soared over the top, a cry that was both terrible and beautiful. It was the sound of a struggle, of a spirit that hadn't been crushed, just buried. And now it was shouting to be heard. Then, suddenly, it all stopped. His hands lifted high, and for a breathless second, there was just the echo ringing in the air and the splash of the fountain. He brought his hands down one last time on a final, magnificent, resolving chord. It was firm. It was sure. It was an answer. The music didn't just fade. It finished. His hands fell from the keys and landed softly in his lap. His head stayed bowed for a long moment, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep, tired breath. He was coming back. The room with the rug faded. The cold of the square seeped back into his bones. The hollow feeling in his stomach returned, a familiar ghost. He slowly opened his eyes. He looked at his own hands, resting in his lap, as if surprised to find them there. He seemed to remember where he was. Very slowly, he lifted his head and looked out. He saw the crowd. Dozens of people. Silent, completely silent, all staring at him. Their faces weren't looking at a homeless man. They were looking at him. Just him. For a few seconds, that silence held. It was thick, full of the weight of what they'd all just shared. No one clapped. No one moved. They were all still in that other place. The music had taken them. The man on the bench looked confused, almost worried. Had he done something wrong? Then the spell broke. The applause didn't start with a clap. It started with a gasp, a release of breath from the woman with the shopping bags. Then her hands came together. Then the father, clapping with his little girl in his arms. Then the teenagers, cheering and whistling. Then the whole crowd erupted. It wasn't polite, after-theater applause. It was loud and wild and full of feeling. People were smiling through tears. They were looking at each other, nodding, as if to say, "Can you believe what we just heard?" The man on the bench blinked, his tired gray eyes wide with shock. A faint, disbelieving smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a small thing, but it changed his whole face. He looked younger. He looked seen. And the sandwich vendor, his heart pounding in his chest, knew exactly what he had to do. He turned back to his cart, moving with a new urgency. He didn't grab the nearest sandwich. He took the freshest loaf of bread. He piled on double portions of the best meat, the sharpest cheese, every vegetable he had. He wrapped it tightly in paper, his hands trembling. He grabbed a bottle of cold water. Then he pushed through the edge of the clapping crowd, toward the piano bench, toward the musician who had just given them all a gift he could never repay. The applause was a warm, living thing. It washed over the man on the piano bench like sunlight he hadn't felt in years. For a long moment, he just sat there, absorbing it, the sound so different from the music that had just left his fingers. The shock on his face slowly softened into a quiet, dazed kind of wonder. He looked at his hands again, as if they belonged to someone else. The sandwich vendor was the first to reach him. He moved through the edge of the clapping crowd, his face earnest, all traces of the earlier scoff gone, replaced by something like awe and a deep yet wrenching regret. He held out the massive, overstuffed sandwich wrapped in crisp paper and the bottle of water like an offering. "Please," was all the vendor could say, his voice thick. He wasn't just giving away food. He was trying to give an apology. The pianist looked from the food to the man's face. He saw the shame there, and he gave a small, slow nod. It wasn't a nod of forgiveness. Exactly, it was more like an understanding. He'd seen that look before, from others, from maybe even himself in a mirror a long time ago. He took the sandwich and the water with a quiet, "Thank you." His voice was rough, but clear. That one act broke the dam. The applause began to die down, but the people moved in. Not in a scary swarm, but in a gentle, hesitant tide. They came one by one, or in little pairs. A man in a business suit, who had been on his phone arguing about quarterly reports, stepped forward. He fumbled in his wallet, not for a single, but for a $20 bill. He pressed it into the pianist's free hand. "That was incredible," he stammered, then melted back into the crowd, looking almost embarrassed by his own emotion. Got an older woman with a kind face and a colorful scarf dug into her tapestry bag. She pulled out a ripe banana and a brand new pair of thick wool socks, still in their packaging. "For the cold," she said simply, placing them on the bench beside him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. A college student with a guitar case strapped to his back just stood there for a second, shaking his head. "Dude," he breathed, the word full of respect. He unzipped his jacket pocket and pulled out a granola bar and a $5 bill. I gotta practice more," he said with a wobbly smile before walking away, looking at his own hands thoughtfully. A little girl, the one who had asked her father why the music was sad, wriggled free from her dad's grip. She had a half-eaten bag of pretzels. She walked right up to the bench and held them out solemnly. The pianist looked down at her, and for the first time, a real full smile broke across his face. It transformed him. He took the pretzel bag with a gentle, "Thank you, sweetheart." She beamed and ran back to her father's legs. It wasn't just about charity anymore. It was a connection. Each person was trying, in their own small way, to touch the magic they had just witnessed, to say, "I saw you. I heard you." They gave what they had on them. A hot coffee from the cart across the square, an apple, a shiny red beanie hat, more crumpled cash. A street artist who drew caricatures came over, and quickly, with a few skilled lines on a pad, sketched the man not as he looked now, but as he had looked when he played head back, eyes closed, lost in the music. He tore it out and gave it to him. The pianist placed each item carefully into his worn backpack, his movements slow, almost ritualistic. His thank yous were soft but steady. He seemed overwhelmed, but in a quiet way. His eyes kept scanning the faces, as if memorizing them. In the middle of all this, a young woman had been standing slightly apart, holding her phone not up to record, but low by her side. She worked for the city's small online newspaper, usually covering neighborhood council meetings and new restaurant openings. She had been cutting through the square to get coffee when the music stopped her in her tracks. Now, as the immediate rush of gifts slowed, she approached. She knelt down so she wasn't standing over him. "Hi," she said, her voice calm and friendly. "I write for the Gazette. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in this square. Would it be all right if I talked with you for a minute?" He looked at her, wary. The wall he kept around himself, the one that had been down while he played, started to come back up a little. He'd had bad experiences with people asking questions. "Just your first name," she said quickly, seeing his hesitation. "No pressure. People should know about this." He studied her face. She had a straightforward look, no pity, just genuine curiosity. He took a slow sip of the water. It was cold and perfect. "Leo," he said finally. It was the first time he'd said his own name to a stranger, and he couldn't remember how long. It felt strange in his mouth. "Leo," she repeated with a smile. "That's a good name. Was that your own music, Leo?" He nodded, looking down at the piano keys. Some of it is just what comes out. Old things mixed up with new. Where did you learn to play like that?" This question always brought the shadows. He shrugged, a small, tight movement. "A long time ago. I taught. For a while." He didn't offer more. The story was right there, in the way he said taught past tense and in the sad, complicated music he'd played. The reporter didn't push. She asked a different question. "What did you think about when you were playing? You seemed somewhere else." Leo was quiet for a long moment. He looked out at the fountain, his gaze far away. "I wasn't thinking," he said softly. "I was just remembering. It's like the piano remembers for you. You put your hands down, and it all comes back." She just nodded, letting the silence sit. She knew she had her headline already. Asterisk, the piano remembers. A lost maestro plays a square into silence. Asterisk. She took out a small notebook. "Is it okay if I write a little about this?" "About the music?" He gave another small nod. "The music is okay. The music isn't mine to keep anyway." As they spoke, the crowd hadn't fully dispersed. A small group lingered, giving them space but listening. They heard the name Leo. They heard taught. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was both more ordinary and more tragic than any myth. This wasn't a magical beggar king. This was a teacher, a musician, a man who had fallen on the hardest of times. The sandwich vendor had been listening too, his arms crossed tight over his chest. He suddenly turned and went back to his cart. He came back with a paper napkin and a pen. He scribbled something on it, his name, Mario, and the address of the soup kitchen his brother ran a few blocks over. "They're good people," he said, handing the napkin to Leo. "They could use a hand sometimes. Or just a hot meal. No questions." It was an offer of a path, a thread to grab onto. Leo took the napkin, folded it carefully, and put it in his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said again, this time looking directly at the vendor. The two men's eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a closing of a circle. The reporter stood up. "Thank you, Leo. Take care of yourself." She gave him a warm smile and walked away, already typing notes into her phone. the story writing itself in her mind. The square was settling back to normal. The tourists were moving again. The office workers were heading back to their desks, many glancing back at the man on the bench. But the air was different. It felt charged, quieter, more thoughtful. Leo sat for a while longer. He opened the sandwich and took a bite. The flavors exploded in his mouth. The sharp cheese, the tangy mustard, the soft, fresh bread. He ate slowly, savoring every bite. His eyes closed in a different kind of bliss now. The gnawing hunger that had driven him to ask the question in the first place was finally, blessedly, being pushed back. He looked at the gifts around him. The money, the food, the socks, the silly pretzels, the beautiful sketch. It was more than he'd carried in years. It was a heavy, wonderful burden. He packed everything carefully into his backpack, which now bulged with possibility. He stood up, his body stiff from sitting. He placed a hand on the top of the piano, giving the smooth wood a gentle pat, like you'd pat the neck of a good horse. Then he slung the heavy backpack over one shoulder. He didn't go back to his spot against the wall. Instead, he stood there for a minute, looking at the flowing water of the fountain, at the people walking, at the whole wide world of the square that had, for a few minutes, listened to him. He felt tired, but it was a good tired. A tired that comes from using a muscle you forgot you had. Then, with a new straightness in his spine, he started walking. He didn't know where he was going exactly. Maybe to find that soup kitchen address. Maybe just to walk and feel the weight of the food in his bag, the hat on his head. But for the first time in a very, very long time, he wasn't walking away from something. He was walking with something. He had been heard. And for a man who had been silent for so long, that was everything. The reporter's article went online that evening. She didn't call Leo a homeless maestro or a virtuoso vagabond. She kept it simple. The headline read, "An Unheard Symphony, the Day the Square Listened." She wrote about the music, about the shocking shift from a scoff to a silence so deep you could hear the fountain. She wrote about the collective hush of the crowd, the tears, the spontaneous gifts. She mentioned he gave his name as Leo, that he had once taught. She focused on the moment, not the mystery. It was a story about a city being surprised by its own heart. But the city ate it up. People shared it not because it was a weird news story, but because it made them feel something good. "Did you see this?" They texted friends. This happened right in the square. The video clips people had taken on their phones started getting stitched together, passed around. The audio was tinny, but you could still hear the power, the sadness, the beauty in it. You could see the transformation on the man's face as he played. By morning, it wasn't just a local story anymore. Leo, meanwhile, had spent the night in the warm, quiet back room of the soup kitchen, courtesy of the vendor's brother. He'd had a shower with real hot water and soap that lathered. He'd put on the new wool socks. It felt like a kind of miracle. He slept on a cot, and for once his sleep was deep, dreamless, and safe. The next day, he was helping wipe down tables after the breakfast service when the kitchen manager came in, looking flustered. "Leo? There's some people here to see you." From the news. A small local TV crew was setting up on the sidewalk outside. The reporter from the paper was there too, with a friendly wave. Leo's first instinct was to shrink back, to disappear into the kitchen steam. This was too much. The music was one thing. This spotlight was another. But the kitchen manager, a big, calm man who had seen all kinds of trouble, put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say a word you don't want to," he said. "But maybe talk about the music. That's yours." So Leo went outside, squinting in the daylight. The TV reporter was a woman with a kind smile. She didn't shove a microphone in his face. She asked gentle questions, much like the newspaper reporter had. Can you tell us about the piece you played? What does music mean to you when you've lost so much? On camera, Leo was hesitant. His words came slow. The piano. It's like a friend who remembers you, he said, echoing what he'd said before. You can be gone a long time. You can come back different. But it remembers. He wouldn't talk about his past, not really. He shook his head at questions about family, about how he ended up on the streets. Life, it gets heavy sometimes. You put it down, and then you can't always pick it back up. That was all he would say, but then they asked if he would play something. Just a little. The crew had brought a small electronic keyboard. Leo looked at it for a long time. Then he sat on the sidewalk bench, placed the keyboard on his lap, and played. It wasn't the stormy, powerful piece from the square. This was something softer, a gentle rolling melody that sounded like morning light. It was hopeful. When he finished, the small crowd that had gathered on the street broke into applause. The clip of that simple, hopeful tune on the morning news got shared even more than the dramatic one from the square. That's when the real letters started coming. Not emails, actual letters, addressed to the soup kitchen for Leo. The manager brought him a cardboard box full of them. People wrote long, messy notes about how his music had made them feel. A woman wrote that she'd been about to give up on her nursing degree, exhausted and broke, and hearing his story gave her the stubbornness to keep going for one more week. A retired piano tuner sent a $10 bill and a note that said the instrument was finally in tune with the player. Thank you. A man wrote about his brother, who had also disappeared into homelessness after a mental break. Your music helped me remember him not as he is now, but as he was. Thank you for that gift. But there were other letters too. Offers. Real, practical offers that made the kitchen manager sit down with Leo over a cup of coffee. Community Music School on the other side of the city wrote. They had a program for at-risk youth. They didn't need a concert pianist. They needed someone who understood struggle, who could show kids that music wasn't just for the perfect and the polished. They offered him a job as a kind of assistant and artist in residence. It was part-time, not much money, but it was real work. They also offered him access to therapy, the kind that helps people put the pieces of a broken life back together. A local church with a small apartment in its basement, used for a homeless shelter overflow, said he could stay there rent-free in exchange for helping with maintenance. It was his own room, with a door that locked. Leo read these letters over and over, his hands trembling. It felt like a trap. Good things in his life had always been followed by bad. He looked at the manager. Why was all he could ask. Why would they do this for me? The manager stirred his coffee. Maybe because you gave them something first. You didn't ask for their pity. You showed them your gift. People want to help a story. Keep going if it's a good one. Let them help Leo. It was the hardest step yet. Harder than asking for food. Harder than sitting at that piano. It was the step of believing that a different future was possible and that he deserved to walk toward it. The fear in his gut was a cold, familiar stone. The street was simple. It was cold and hard, but you knew the rules. This was unknown. For 2 days, he barely spoke. He helped in the kitchen, chopped vegetables, swept floors, all while this big decision churned inside him. He looked at the people at the soup kitchen lines, the tired faces, the lost eyes. He was one of them. Was he leaving them behind? Was he pretending to be something he wasn't? On the third morning, he was taking out the trash. He passed a young guy, maybe 19, leaning against the wall, kicking at the pavement. The guy looked up, recognized him. Hey, the kid said, a challenging tone in his voice. You're the piano guy, right? Got famous, huh? Leo stopped. He nodded. "Must be nice," the kid said, his voice full of a bitter envy. "Getting all that help." Leo put the trash bags down. He looked at the kid, really looked at him. He saw the defensive slouch, the anger that was really just fear. He saw himself from years ago. "It is scary," Leo said, his voice quiet. The kid blinked, thrown off by the answer. "What?" "The help," Leo said. "It's scary. The street. You know what's coming. This. You don't." He picked up the bags again. "But I think I'm going to be scared either way. Might as well be scared somewhere warm." He didn't wait for a response. He walked to the dumpster, heaved the bags in. When he came back, the kid was gone. That afternoon, he told the kitchen manager he'd like to try the job at the music school. The manager clapped him on the back, a big, solid thump that almost knocked the wind out of him. The move to the church basement apartment was a quiet affair. He had his backpack and one new bag of things, some clothes, toiletries, all bought with the gift money from the square. The room was small, with a high window that let in a square of sunlight. It was clean. It was his. He sat on the bed and cried, not with sadness, but with a relief so profound it shook his whole body. He hadn't realized how heavy it was to carry the whole world on your back, to never have a place to set it down. He started at the music school the following week. The first day, he just sat in the back of a practice room while a young, energetic teacher tried to get a group of bored teenagers to care about scales. Leo didn't say anything. He just listened. After class, one of the kids, a boy with big headphones around his neck, lingered. "You're the guy from the video, right?" "The square?" Leo nodded. The boy shifted his weight. "That thing you played. The fast part. How'd you do that without looking?" Leo walked over to the piano. "Your hands learn the geography," he said. "The keys are like hills and valleys. You don't have to look. You just have to remember the map." He played a quick, glittering run. The boy's eyes widened. It wasn't a magical, instant connection. But it was a start. A real one. Leo's story didn't have a fairy tale ending, because it wasn't an ending. It was a new beginning, and beginnings are messy and hard. There were days the therapy was exhausting, pulling up old pain he'd buried. There were days he felt like an imposter at the school. There were days the loneliness in his little room was louder than the loneliness on the street. But there were also moments. Sitting at a well-tuned piano in a quiet room at the school, playing whatever he wanted. The first time he got a small paycheck and bought himself a new pair of shoes. The day the teenager from that first class brought him a CD of his favorite rapper, saying, "It's got piano in it. Thought you should hear it." He was putting down roots, tiny and fragile, in a world he had fallen out of long ago. He was becoming Leo again, not just the man on the bench, or the man against the wall, but someone new, built from the pieces of the old. The music had opened a door. Now, slowly, and with great care, he was walking through it. A year is a long time, and no time at all. The seasons turned in the city. The cold, biting air that had filled the square the day Leo played softened into spring, blazed into summer, faded into a golden fall, and then the chill returned once more. Leo's life now had a shape to it, a schedule. It was a strange feeling, like wearing a new coat that was stiff at first, but eventually took on the form of his body. His home was the small basement room at the church. It was simple, but it was his. He had a key. That key, on a simple ring in his pocket, was maybe the most important thing he owned. It meant he belonged somewhere about 3 mornings a week. He took the bus across town to the community music school. He wasn't a formal teacher. His official title was music mentor, which he still found a little funny. Mostly he was just there. He would sit in on classes, his presence calm and quiet. Sometimes a kid struggling with a difficult passage would look over at him, and he'd just give a small nod or walk over and play it slowly, his hands showing the way without a word. He didn't talk much about theory. He talked about feeling. It's not just notes, he'd say to a frustrated girl banging on the keys. It's a conversation. Listen to what the piano is saying back to you. The students, especially the tough, closed-off ones, gravitated toward him. They sensed he wasn't from a perfect, shiny world of concerts and trophies. He was from a harder place. When a boy named Ben, who had a stutter and a fierce temper, threw his sheet music on the floor in a rage, the main teacher was ready to send him out. Leo just bent down, picked up the pages, and smoothed them out. Sounds like you're fighting it, Leo said quietly. It's stupid. Ben spat, his face red. Yeah, Leo agreed, which surprised the boy. Music can be stupid, but sometimes the fight is the best part. He sat at the piano and played a piece that was all clash and drama, full of angry, pounding chords. See? That's the sound of being mad at the world. You can put that in here. He pointed to the sheet music. Ben stared, then slowly sat back down. He didn't play perfectly that day, but he played with feeling. This was Leo's work. It was slow, often frustrating, and deeply rewarding in a way he'd never known. He was giving back the thing that had saved him, not as a grand performance, but as a passed-on secret, one kid at a time. The therapy was harder work. It happened in a small office with a kind woman who asked questions that made him sweat. They dug into the past, into the losses that had sent him spiraling, the family grief, the lost career, the slow, crushing shame that had made the streets seem easier than facing people. Some days he left those sessions feeling raw and empty, like an open wound. On those days, the little room at the church felt too quiet, and the old pull to just walk and walk, to disappear back into the anonymous crowd, was strong. But he had anchors now. He had to show up at the school. People expected him. The church pastor would knock on his door just to ask if he wanted a cup of tea. The sandwich vendor from the square, the one who had scoffed, now came by the soup kitchen once a month to help serve. He'd always make a point to find Leo, clap him on the shoulder, and ask, "Still playing?" It was an apology that lasted a year, and it had become a friendship. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost a full year after the day in the square, the director of the music school came to see him. The school was having a small winter recital for the students and the community. "We were wondering," the director said, "if you would play something to open the evening. Just a short piece." Leo felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Playing in the square had been an act of desperation. Playing for the students here, and there was different. But a performance? On a stage? With people sitting and watching, expecting something? The old fears rushed back, the fear of failing, of being judged, of the silence afterward. "I don't know," he said, looking at the floor. "I'm not that kind of player anymore." The director, a wise older man who played the cello, just smiled. "You're exactly that kind of player. Think about it." Leo did think about it. He thought about it for days. He wrestled with it in his little room, the key feeling heavy in his pocket. He finally mentioned it to Ben, the angry, talented student. "You should do it," Ben said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Everyone else is going to play boring stuff. You should play something real." The night of the recital arrived. The school's small auditorium was packed with parents, siblings, friends, and people from the neighborhood. There were folding chairs in the aisles. Leo waited in a small side room, hearing the buzz of the crowd. He wore a simple, clean shirt he'd bought for the occasion. His hands were trembling. This felt like 1,000 times more terrifying than the square. Back then, he had nothing to lose. Now, he had a life he cared about losing. He heard his name introduced. The director didn't list his past. He simply said, "Our mentor and friend, who reminds us every day where true music comes from, will begin our evening." Leo walked out. The stage lights were bright, warm. He could see the crowd as a blur of faces. His heart hammered against his ribs. He sat at the grand piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands in his lap. The silence was expectant, polite. He closed his eyes. He wasn't in the square. He wasn't on a stage. He was back in his little basement room, in the quiet of the early morning, playing for no one but himself. He thought of the past year, the fear, the small victories, the hot shower, the kid who shared his rap music, the weight of the key. He thought of the long, silent years before that. He didn't play the stormy, heart-wrenching piece from the square. That was a song from the bottom of the well. He began to play something new. It started softly, a simple, questioning melody. It was the sound of a door opening slowly, of light falling into a dark room. It was hesitant, full of space and quiet. Then, slowly, it began to grow. A note of warmth entered, then a thread of something like hope, not a blinding, joyful hope, but a stubborn, fragile one. The kind that comes after a long winter, when you're not sure if spring is real. But you see a single green shoot anyway. The music wove together the loneliness and the connection, the old pain and the new peace. It wasn't perfect. In one passage, his left hand faltered for a second, a tiny stumble. He didn't panic. He just breathed, and his right hand carried the melody until the left could find its way back. It was human. It was real. He finished as softly as he had begun, on a single clear note that seemed to hang in the air, not as a question, but as a quiet statement. The applause that followed was different from the square's wild, surprised eruption. This was deeper, warmer, full of knowing. People had come to hear their kids play scales, and they had been given this. They stood up. He saw faces, the director nodding, the therapy lady wiping her eyes, Ben grinning and punching the air. He saw the sandwich vendor, standing at the back, giving him 2 thumbs up. Leo stood, gave a small, awkward bow, and walked off the stage. The shaking in his hands was gone. He felt a stillness inside, a solid calm. After the recital, as parents hugged their children and gathered coats, an older man approached him. He had gentle eyes and the careful hands of a musician. "That was beautiful," the man said. "It reminded me that music isn't about the notes we play, but about the life we play between them." Later, walking home under the cold, starry sky, Leo felt the familiar weight of his key. The city sounds were the same, the distant sirens, the rumble of a bus, the laughter from a bar. But he was different inside them. He wasn't just passing through anymore. He was a part of it. He wasn't fixed. He knew that. The sadness of the past would always be a thread in his music, in his soul. Some days would still be hard. But he had a place. He had work that mattered. He had a quiet room to return to. He had learned that sometimes salvation doesn't come as a dramatic rescue. It comes as a series of small offered hands, a sandwich, a pair of socks, a job, a key. It comes when you find the courage to play your truth, not for food, but for the simple, profound reason that the music is in you and it deserves to be heard. And in the hearing, both the player and the listener are changed, note by single note.